Okay. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Men's Development Network's seminar on Boys Will Be Boys. And the most important part of that title is the question mark. And when we're going to talk about boys today and raising boys, this is the third of our series of our seminars, if you want to call it that, where we've had a couple of seminars and webinars in relation to men and COVID-19 and health. And plus also we had a recent seminar around the importance of creativity in terms of emotional well-being for men, in terms of looking through the eyes of the heart was another one. And then this is our third seminar that we're doing now. And we have another further 3 more before the end of the summer as well. So that's our plan as we've moved into post-COVID and into COVID as we are. So again, welcome. Delighted you could make it here today, and I want to just do a quick introduction to our panelists today. We have Edel Hackett. She is an independent media consultant in some way, if you want to put it that way, and she's also works with Safe Ireland, the domestic violence networking and advocacy group. We also then have Finian Murphy, who's a managing director of core marketing and an advocate in relation to fathering and paternity, and has also been very much involved in the Yes campaign and the marriage equality campaign. Our third panelist then is Philip O'Connor, who is a journalist and broadcast journalist living in Sweden. He's become the font of all information in relation to our what happens across in Sweden and the model of social democracy wherever we are there, and he reports on that across Irish media as well. And then our final panelist then is Sarah Benson, who's the CEO of Women's Aid. And I suppose the critical thing as part of all those panelists is there that they are involved in certain work around gender equality and gender, but also they are parents as well, and they have a commitment young people and boys and stuff like that. So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time to come to us today. And I'm going to ask each of you really to come over to do a bit of an introduction, a bit more about yourselves, okay? But as well as that, I'd kind of maybe like to pose the initial question around boys and looking at boys. And I suppose there was a piece of research done by Promundo and Caring Foundation recently, and one of the things that they said was that, interestingly, when boys are between the ages of 10 and 8, when they begin to broaden their worlds, an interesting thing happens for them, in that their understanding of masculinity and what we'd like to, in terms of a healthy masculinity, the broadest terms of healthy masculinities narrows for them as they go further out into the world. And I think that's an interesting thing that actually happens for them. And I suppose what I'd like to do is ask everybody about that thought, what they think about that and the thoughts on that. And as part of, as well as that, then to introduce themselves, where they're coming from, and then to give some feedback in terms of that. So, so Edel, I'll come to yourself if you could start us off. And
okay, thanks very much. I'm unfortunately my name begins with E, so I think it's done in alphabetical order. So I get started. Yeah, I mean, you gave an introduction to some of my work life. I would see that my primary job in many ways is to be the mother of, I'm the mother of 3 children, but they're not children anymore, they're actually young adults. The youngest is 17, he's a boy, the next one is 20, and then I have a girl, he's 22. And I suppose in many ways, despite everything that we try and do, because I've tried to rear them, not non-gender specific, but to try and raise them within quite a progressive household. And despite that, it never ceases to amaze me, I suppose, and this is kind of core to what we're talking about today. It never ceases to amaze me how 3 people can be raised in the same household and be so different. Just to give you an example, over COVID, I was working, we all were, like I know Sarah was as well, we were working a lot over COVID because of the prevalence of domestic violence in particular. But when I came home, like Sarah, my daughter would say, I've just peeled the vegetables, or I've done this, or I've done the other. And then the other 2 would emerge sort of from various PlayStations, mobile phones, whatever, and just ask, like, when is dinner? what are we having for dinner, having taken no part in that, you know, but yet they're raised in the same household. So this always frustrates me. And I suppose in many ways, instead of just kind of looking at the lads and going, what are you talking about? I have to look into myself. And I feel, again, this is part of the conversation, that I have to really ask serious questions about the way in which I have actually raised them. I've done the best I can, but yet, you know, there seems to be a delineation, and there seems to be a sense of almost entitlement that this is what the girls do and this is what I do. And that is a never ending source of frustration for me, I suppose. You know, I go back to, I was thinking with Safe Ireland, we had a summit in 2018, and there was an amazing woman called Insia Darawali. She's an Indian activist, an advocate, a survivor. She's a filmmaker. And one of the things that really struck me from that summit was that she said, if men have sown the seeds of patriarchy, women have also watered these seeds and have perpetuated those patriarchal norms. So in many ways within this conversation, that's kind of where I'm starting. And then, you know, on the other side, I've also had extremely, you know, I've had amazing relationships with boys, and I have huge amount of respect for young men and for boys in particular. I've been a coach in athletics for 12 years, and I feel like I've had a, you know, an opportunity to be a coach and to be a mentor without being somebody's mother, and that's fantastic as well to have had that experience, you know. And then just coming back, I suppose, to the points that you were asking about, you know, looking particularly at the Promundo research, like I found it quite depressing. I found it quite, you know, frightening that boys would feel that to show emotional strength or to show emotions is weak. But I'm not surprised by it in any way. And I do agree, and broaden their such a social network, they become more constrained. Their concept of masculinity becomes more narrowed. I do agree with that. And again, I started to think back to my own lads. And in primary school, they were much freer. You know, they were much more likely to cry. They were much more likely to show emotion. And that was encouraged. But as they went on and as they got into 5th and 6th class, I felt that they were constrained. They became more constrained. There was more, they got a sense of what they should be rather than what they want to be. And that has continued through secondary school. And I do think that boys in Ireland, I really feel, and girls, are doubly constrained by the fact that we have an education system that is predominantly same-sex education. And I mean, I live in a small town. We didn't have a choice. We didn't have co-education in the town. The boys went to you know, testosterone heaven, basically, is what I would call it. They went to an all-boys school. One of them is still there. Now, it's turned out to be much better than I ever expected it to be, but it's really unhealthy that there's 650 lads in this kind of bubble. And it's also really unhealthy that down the road there are 650 girls in another bubble, you know. So I feel that there, you know, in Ireland we're doubly constrained as such, and that those kind of constraining parameters are become even tighter and more constricting because of the education system that we have as well, that we need to look at that. And that's perhaps something that we'd look at when we look at next steps. So I've probably said enough as an introduction. I'm sure you have other people to talk to, but I hope that begins to open up some conversation.
Oh, well, it certainly has, Edel. And before I got to you, Finian, I forgot some of my housekeeping there, really. And I just to encourage people to use the chat bar to introduce themselves today and just introduce where they're coming from, what organization they are, but also to use the Q&A element there so that they can actually ask questions for us and we can kind of go through it on that end. But so apologies, I should have said that. And for people to be aware, when they're on the chat room, on the chat bar, that they make sure that they put it to all panelists and attendees so everybody can see their quotes or their introduction on the chat room. Thanks again, Edel. Finian, would you like to maybe introduce yourself and to give your thoughts as well in terms of an opening thoughts?
Yeah, well, first of all, Sean, thanks for having me on. And I think, like what Edel was saying there, you know, I'm a parent, I try. I'm a brother and a friend, and, you know, the efforts are being made, I think, to, I suppose, better set up the world for boys and young men. But I use the word effort because I think it's a really big challenge. I think as the research highlights, that definition of what manhood and masculinity is about, it becomes so narrow. And I think from my own personal experience, also so dull and boring. I had an interesting education, to Edel's point around single-sex education. I went in my early years to a mixed co-ed, but then for about 4 or 5 years, the early teens, into single-sex, and then back again to mixed. But throughout those periods, I always enjoyed having a mixed group of friends, and learning from both young men and young women. And the depths and broadness of conversations that can take place. So I think where I've come to in more has been, you mentioned my involvement with Yes Equality. I was privileged and kind of accidentally got involved in the same-sex marriage referendum, and really what that opened up to me is the sense of a better understanding of identity and your true self, and so much amazing advocacy work by LGBT and also the feminist movement really highlights that men really have to start asking themselves questions about what it is that we want to be, both as individuals and as a collective, because we've never A, had that responsibility, and B, had that opportunity. And I think we're at that point now where there is a real opportunity for us to ask ourselves, who do we want to be, and how do we role model that with young men and boys in our life. So fast forward, I suppose, to where I'm at now. I have a 4-year-old and I have a 9-month-old, and it's a fun roller coaster. It's a juggle. Huge privilege. And Tom, when he entered the world 4 years ago, quiet, timid character. I always tell the story about when I'm on the bus, and elderly, very well-intended women would often point and say, "Oh, she's very cute and very timid and very calm." And it was always she. So immediately there was the projection of kind of feminine characteristics onto a young boy. I wouldn't bother correcting. And Joy now actually seems to be a little bit more energetic. And I would imagine if she was dressed in neutral clothing, she would get the kind of opposite of that. So I think in a lot of ways, we have this opportunity as parents to, and as early as possible, begin to look at simple everyday language, thinking about the pronouns. A simple thing I started just speaking with friends and colleagues, and I just talk about my child or my children, rather than the boy or the girl, and clothes, toys. But it comes at you very, very quickly. Whether it's family or friends, we bring with us a lot of our own understandings of identity and place them on others. So it's constant, and it's to go back to that word, it's an effort, but I think it's a worthwhile effort.
Okay, cheers, Finian. And coming to yourself, Philip, and being the outer European context today, in terms of being in Sweden, maybe give us an introduction to yourself as well, and then your own thoughts that you'd have, and also to kind of maybe talk about the locker room campaign that you talked about before as well. It would be really interesting.
Yeah, I suppose, I'll echo what the previous contributors have said. I grew up in Dublin. I was born in 1971, so I would have gone through national school, secondary school there. That would have been, the first, I think it was high babies, low babies, first class. That would have been mixed. But after that, it was only boys up until the leaving cert. And then I left school. And I think I was 33 when my daughter was born. She's 15 now. And I was 33 when my daughter was born. At that stage, I've been living in Sweden for probably 5 years. And I remember being handed her in the maternity hospital and think, I have no fucking fucking idea about women whatsoever. And it wasn't just her. It wasn't just that she was a girl. It was just that whole process. We never learned anything about women in school. In fact, we were deliberately kept apart from girls for a lot of the time. So a lot of my sort of upbringing or a lot of my own sort of personal journey has been about learning to be a man, and who I learned that from, be it my father or my grandfather. My father was a very quiet man who never drank, loved sport, that kind of thing. My grandfather was exactly the opposite. He was a very gregarious and said that. And it's how did I learn to be the man that I am today, which at one stage wasn't really a positive thing. So I lived in Sweden for 20 years, a very gender equal society. People couldn't believe that I came from a country where abortion was illegal and this kind of thing, so these things came up all the time. So there was a constant sort of process of questioning for me for the last basically all my adult life as to how am I supposed to relate to women? What am I supposed to do? And how am I supposed to be a man? And that's the thing that, that sticks with me to this day. And it was about 2.5, 3 years ago. I was I'm still involved in sort of manly things, still play Gaelic football, still involved in martial arts. And one night we were teaching a course, a self-defense course for women, when I realized that there's very little I can teach a woman physically that's going to help her against somebody like me who's 6'3", 14 stone. I can basically do whatever it is I want, right? And at the same time, I was coaching a football team of young, tough lads from a suburb here. And I realized that the best thing I can do to protect women is not teach them how to defend themselves. It's to teach these young fellas not to be arseholes and to treat them with respect. And that was when the sort of penny dropped for me. At the same time as that was going on, there was a couple of young fellas down the country here in Sweden, and they started a project called Locker Room Talk. And Locker Room Talk came from that famous quote by Donald Trump, who said the whole grab them by the pussy line was locker room talk. That's accepted in that context. And these lads started to think, well, why? Because the way we talk there, it infuses our behavior, it infuses the things we say, it infuses the things we do, it infuses how we treat women in our everyday lives. And it doesn't matter if you have mothers or sisters or daughters, it becomes part of that narrative. And they started then to work by making 8 or 10 visits to a club and talking to young fellas between the ages of about 10 or 16, asking them why they felt they had to act in a certain way. Why did they feel they had to call a fella a fag or a homo or a queer or whatever if he did something that wasn't manly or perceived as being that way, and to question these kinds of behaviors and to try to change them. So I've been involved in that sort of thought process, and I've coached these lads for a long time. I've seen the little tweaks that you can make by changing the way people talk. But also we had, I think it was Edel was talking about how men express their feelings. And I realized about 7 years ago, I don't know if you remember, Sweden was in the Highlands, a place called Husby, which is one stop from where I'm talking to you now on the underground. There was riots there, and those riots were sort of an explosion of violence against the police. But what that was rooted in was an inability to be understood, right? So when people weren't listened to, when they felt that they couldn't make their case in the media or to politicians, or in this case to the police, then things exploded. And that was when I realized that an awful lot of the violence that we engage in as men, be it verbal or mental or physical, is down to this inability to communicate our feelings. So those two things for me go hand in hand. How we speak about women, how we think about women when we're with other men, but also how we behave ourselves, what we feel that we are safe to reveal and that. And, it's not always safe to do these things, but it's a question of creating an environment in which we feel safe to do those things.
Yeah. Brilliant, Philip. And I think it is interesting, and I suppose in some ways it brings us to Sarah in terms of her own work and where she's coming from as well. So Sarah, if you'd maybe like to jump in and give us your thoughts.
Well, firstly, thanks, Sean, for inviting me. I suppose, a little bit about my kind of work background and then maybe the family reflection. I actually went to the very first Educate Together school in Ireland, which was the Dalkey School project, and so I've been co-ed all the way. And there was no secondary school then, so I went to a school called New Park, which had a sister school on the north side, which were about the most progressive schools you could find at the time. So always valued the idea as a girl being able to have boys as friends, because I had friends who were in secondary schools that were all girls, and it was very discernible by the time we were getting into kind of fifth year that their attitude, their starting point when they met a boy was quite different to what mine would have been, given that I had a strong core of male friends at that stage. So something I always kept in mind in terms of education plans for, if I was a parent myself. And then when I went to college, I did an arts undergrad, but then I did gender and women's studies as a postgrad. So that was kind of the start of a very more focused journey in terms of if you're considering gender equality, you also have to consider concepts of masculinity alongside the binary, which was the binary at the time. It's much more diffuse now, but at the same time, what it means to be a woman in the world as a counterpoint to, what it means to be a man in the world and what those messages were. And, and then just through my kind of work experience, I mean, I was involved in the student helpline service all through college, including my postgrad, the Nightline service. And, there was kind of revelations to me there where, supporting, men as well as young men and young women, but the kinds of things that, were not spoken about at all, but were coming up in those environments, like the real loneliness that some young men were experiencing, the struggles with sexuality, but also things like body image were already starting to be a thing there. It's the first time I ever came across a young man who had effectively had an eating disorder, things that you didn't even conceive of and were absolutely not spoken about at the time. And then I suppose I worked in community development. I did youth work overseas and then moved quite specifically into the area of working on violence against women, to combat violence against women, so domestic violence. And then a number of years working on sexual violence, commercial sexual exploitation, trafficking, and now back as I am with Women's Aid, which is a domestic violence support service. So, working for gender equality means, having to look at all of our society and the round. We're not in a vacuum, and of course that means how do we, create and generate alliances with men, because when you're combating male violence against women, the problem isn't women. And something I think Finian you said around, it was yourself, Philip, said around, prevention is the absolute core of this. But then it comes back down to, when you're looking at young people and children, just how early that needs to start, because, there are issues being raised by the likes of the Red Crisis Network and others, where we're now dealing with quandaries such as, we have a child who's a perpetrator, but they're a child, and what do we do about that, and how did we get to that place? And I suppose that circles back then to why, the opening conversation, Sean, when you picked up the phone, said, would you be interested in kind of pitching in on this conversation, is that I'm also a mother, and I'm a mother of a son, and I'm a mother of a daughter, and I have a 15-year-old son and a 13-year-old daughter. And I remember when I knew I was having my daughter, I remember saying out loud, okay, so this is now a chance to raise a good man and a strong woman. And I don't know why or where that came from, but I thought about it, I said it, and I kept saying it. And it was like, well, what is a good man? And what is a strong woman? And, and why the difference, And so from the get-go, I could see that there were different hopes I had that were definitely embedded in what maybe that public, the stereotypes of, what it is to be a girl, what it is to be a boy, what it is to be a man, what it is to be a woman. And from the get-go, I remember feeling real frustration that I wanted to dress my kids in colourful, eclectic children's clothes, and it was almost impossible to find boys' clothes that weren't little men's clothes, like little chinos and little shirts and uncomfortable things without colour, things without pattern, things that were already putting them in a little box. And I remember having to go online to do it. And in fact, I think it's the Danish brand Oil Lily, and trying to find, things that would, not pigeonhole them from the absolute get-go, whereas it was so easy to find stuff for my daughter. It was just everywhere, and I think when I was looking through the research, and I think one of my fears as a mother for a son is this idea of going it alone. And it struck me when they were showing in this particular research that in terms of TV shows, not the same in movies, but in TV shows, nearly 50% of the leads are women, but they have 68% of the speaking time. Now, what they say, may be open to scrutiny, but what is with the silence, and what does that mean? And I feel like, especially, visibility of different children, my son would be, non-neurotypical in some respects, and, the visibility of difference, and creating opportunities for somebody to be themselves in their own skin. And, I'm lucky that my kids have been through the Educate Together system and have a very precarious, currently homeless secondary school that we're trying to hold on to. And that gives me great optimism. But then, the question is, when you have a media saturation and the kind of messages that are coming out, which is, not necessarily encouraging boys to ask for help, to say, you know, I'm struggling. You know, those are the things that I think we need to help to create resilience, reinforce them so that they can go their own route, that they don't feel that there's a path that's already carved for them. And, you know, and that, you know, being good and being strong are actually the same thing. And, you know, that's me having to reconcile that. But I suppose, yeah, that's, I suppose, my jumping off point, not necessarily very coherent, but I'll stop there. Perhaps Sean.
Well, I think one of the things that's come out as well, I think, just coming from what all of you have said there, is the challenge, the significant challenge around trying to address the issue for boys in terms of being what we call our most authentic selves, or being the best men that they can be. You know, it's a real challenge to go out and do that. And I suppose if we were to look at that, you know, what are the kind of those core values that we want to bring to that? You know, what are the values about being a man? Like when we talked about earlier on about saying, I think it's really interesting what you're saying, Sarah, about this concept that you have to, you're on your own here.
Yeah.
As a man or as a boy, you know, when you're on your own, it's a difficult one. Edel, you were going to say something there?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to pick up on that actually, because I think that is one of the big issues, you know, as the box becomes more constrained, you know, it's hard at any age to stand out. And I think, you know, I'm just thinking about, say, going back to within work. I mean, I also am an associate with an agency called Persuasion Republic, and we have worked on 2 particular campaigns over the last 8 years. And at the heart of both of those campaigns, one is called Man Up, and the other one is We Don't Buy It, which was work that we did with Sarah a number of years back with Rahama, which was I suppose what both of those campaigns are rooted really in harnessing the power and the good in men, do you know? And actually interesting, Philip, I know from your looking at your background that you have an interest in MMA. And one of the things that we did with Man Up, for example, was we used Cathal Pendred, who was an MMA fighter at the time. And, you know, and there was a backlash against that a little bit, because there was this notion that, like, why are you working with somebody who's involved in such a violent sport? But actually what he brought to it was that he said, yes, you know, I train. And this is, for example, was this notion of the image that young boys have of what it means to be strong. You know, so an image is, you know, a 6-pack bench pressing. I mean, I see it at home all the time. I've said throughout COVID that I don't live in a house. I actually live in a gym at this stage. And, you know, and this is what they see as a strength. And what both of those campaigns were about were 2 things. One was harnessing that strength, but showing that actually emotional strength is as strong as physical strength. And I think that's something that we really have to work on as parents, as mentors, as guides to young people. That, you know, that it's great to have physical strength, but it's not the only strength. You need to have emotional understanding, emotional strength, you know, emotional power in many ways. And the other thing, which goes back to this issue around not standing alone, the other thing that we did with both of those campaigns, and I think it's really important, again, you know, if we're looking at prevention campaigns as steps forward, was that we wrote everything, and everything was in the narrative of we, you know. So for example, you know, it is not strange to be standing out, to be speaking out, to be stepping out of the norm and out of the stereotype. It shouldn't be that. It should be the normal. So you should actually feel that you're part of the majority in saying, you know what, I don't like the way you treated that girl. You know what, I don't buy sex, and neither do the majority of men buy sex. You know, actually, you know, the fact that we're told that it's the opposite is just a myth, for example. Do you know what I mean? So I think that there's I suppose I don't want to wander too much, but I think that's a really important thing, that we need to break this notion that you are alone because you are doing the right thing, and you're talking about emotional power rather than just focusing on physical power, for example. Do you know?
But I think the point, the critical point around it, Edel, is around that notion that as a boy or as a young man, that you're meant to be self-reliant, that you don't need to reach out. The greatest sign of weakness is to express your emotions, to show your emotions. Except if you're standing on a football pitch with a jersey on and the national anthem's playing. That's the only time you're allowed to be emotional, you know, in some senses, you know. So, so there is, I think that.
Change that. You see, I think we have to change that. Like, I mean,
absolutely,
you know, yeah. I'm looking at my daughter is 22. You know, like we've spoken about sports. I have 3 very sporty kids. We didn't encourage sports in the family. They just happened to be like that. You know, so there is an issue of nature and nurture there as well. Yeah. But the thing is that she, I think, is much more self-assured. Ironically, you know, she's actually much more self-assured. She's much more confident. But I think one of the reasons that she is that she has the feminist movement as a framework. And it goes back to what Finian was talking about, was that actually, you know, there needs to be a kind of a man's movement, or there needs to be the equivalence of a feminist movement for young boys, that they don't feel like. My daughter is much more self-assured in saying what she means, and she's not afraid that somebody's going to cut her off. Now, of course, feminism is scoffed at by the 2 lads all the time, which really annoys me. But I'm constantly saying to them that actually you need to embrace it, and you need to see it as a challenge, and you need to actually see it as something that you need to aspire to be human beings. You know. Yeah. So anyway, that's. Sorry, I just shouldn't have occupied so much space.
Not Sarah, you want to come in there?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I mean, in spirit, I'm with Edel in terms of the aspiration, but I also think there's structural things that we can do to support that better, particularly in Ireland. And I mean, I'm clearly a flag flyer for a particular educational model, unapologetically, but we do have opportunities here with our current. I think one of the issues is this terror of talking to children about, you know, things like sexuality, you know, until really that ship has sailed. You know, I got a book when I'd had my second child, and it was How to Talk to Your Kids About Sex at Any Age. And it starts very young, you know, and it can be done. And, you know, and at the moment there is a review of the educational curriculum, and that SPHE program integrates everything. But what it also needs to fundamentally integrate is that the attitudes, the respect. I mean, I was interested, and I'd love to know what the answer to this question is, you know, this idea of strong, you know, what a strong man is. And, you know, there's a lot said about you know, if we were to ask boys, well, what would a strong girl look like to you? You know, what are her qualities, her attributes, you know, how are they different or the same? And to start that as a discussion with kids when they're so young and so open to having those. And so that requires exposure, which I do think requires boys and girls to be together, and those conversations starting from the very youngest age, because it's, you know, it's not everybody the same, but it's about valuing qualities and attributes in each other that then engender respect, and that then can lead to later on those questions of, well, you know, we shouldn't even be talking about consent by the time they then get to, you know,
to get to that age group.
And I
suppose coming to the kind of the next session, I suppose it's around that we are, I suppose, incredibly conscious around what unhealthy masculinities do for a society, okay, in terms of the impacts that it can have. Both in terms of for the individual, which you talked about, the individual boy or man there that we've talked about earlier on, and then the other things that happen around society in terms of relationships, attitudes to women, you know, to violence as well, a critical aspect around violence, because that kind of, one of the things in the Promundo stuff when they talked about boys and their attitude to violence, you know, or what do they mean by strong? It meant actually to be able to physically stand up for yourself. That's what they meant by being strong, and it was really interesting to see that. And actually, parents had the same expectation as well, that they needed to be able to stand. That's what they meant by being a strong young man was. And I suppose as kind of with that kind of thing, like, you know, so how early really should we start? You know, you mentioned there, Sarah, that early thought about that, but how early should we start really about deconstructing these notions of gender and masculinity with young people, and with young girls and boys in schools? So, Finian, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, to me, lad culture it's wrapped up in, you know, competition. You know, you're competing. You mentioned about being physically strong, but also don't show any sign of vulnerability, any weakness of emotion. we compete for the girl. That's the competition in the teens, and we take this all the way through to the 20s and 30s, where we're competing with each other in careers. A lot of it designed around to get one up on somebody else. Good competition, healthy competition is good. It pushes us on. Some of the best games you can attend is based out of healthy competition. The problem is when it becomes really dominant and it becomes so kind of toxic that it's an absolute win-lose equation in your relationships. For me, I think the world's a cooperative approach. The successes in so many domains is around working together in a network, and also working towards focus more on care. So I always look at the equation around competition versus care. How can we dial up care as a really important skill set for the next generation of not just both genders? How do we get people to think about, well, how do I care about others or my community, and then the work I do or how I spend my time. And with that, it brings about kind of more attention, more focus, and it's a big part of that then is around the kind of language of emotions and knowing how to express yourself. It's okay to get angry if we can express it in the right, using the right words. It's also okay to be very upset about situations, but so much of that is a huge education. I think being in mixed environments helps with that, but we really need to see. I would hope to think my generation of men, crying in front of their kids. Coming down from an angry situation by using language in the correct way, and I think role modeling is going to be key. But if we can bring more focus on not trying to win every situation, but how do we create kind of mutual benefit for all parties? It's dare I say it's a win-win for everyone. It's the utopian thing is it's a much more interesting, richer, happier space that we can all be living in.
Okay. And just say, Philip, in terms of Sweden, it is held up as that social model, but what has been the difference there? Taking that you haven't lived here, you haven't lived in Ireland, but what has been the difference there, do you think? What has made the difference there around that more gender equal society, or at least an awareness of it there in Sweden?
Yeah, I think it's that very awareness of it, and then there's the government takes a very active role in sort of presenting these things. So if you look at when parental leave was introduced in the 1970s in this country, initially most of the time would have gone to the mother, and the father was encouraged to take X amount of time. I think at the beginning it was only 3 weeks, and then that went up to 3 months, and the uptake was very low. So what would happen was the mother would, it'd be given to the parents as a pair, and then they'd split it, and the mother would take sort of everything, and the father might take 2 weeks in the beginning. And then the government realized that, okay, you can't be doing this because, it was seen as being, women's work, having children, that kind of thing. So men were then told, okay, well, there's 3 months now and only you can take it. Your wife, your partner, the mother of your child can't take it. You have to take it yourself. And that gradually got more and more men to start taking it. So it's not just, the advertising executive who goes out with his buggy and a latte. It's also the carpenter, the welder, the electrician. They take these things as well now because that has become ingrained, because the state supports that from beneath, so it becomes a thing of, being a father to your children, being an active and present father to your children is not seen as being it's no shame on my father, but he went to Croke Park just after I was born. He walked from the rotunda to Croke Park, and I probably would have done exactly the same thing in his shoes had I been there, But, if you learn a different way of doing things, a different way of relating to it, in Sweden, men or fathers were often more present at the birth. So simple things like that, where it's encouraged and where there's an incentive to do these things. But I think the much bigger discussion is around, what the previous contributors were saying. This idea that strength is equated with dominance is a terribly poisonous idea. This idea, as Finian mentioned, about competition. What is winning? this whole idea of, you know, your life unbeaten and something. It's great that you had, it was Edel that had Carl Pender involved in a project there. Carl's a great guy to have involved in this because he thinks very, very deeply about these things. Journalism is a very competitive profession, right? There are people who've done things. I've broken stories that everybody has to go, oh, I wish I'd done that. I only compete against myself, because as long as I'm doing my best, you know, I don't expect any more of myself, and I can't deliver any more than that. So as far as that gets me, I'm happy. If I have a great idea, a great story, if I go to a martial arts competition, we'll lose. It doesn't matter as long as I've done my best. And that's the kind of thing that we should, you know, this idea that you have to be dominant, like, it's just such nonsense, and it creates an impossible aspiration for young men that I have to go out here, I have to do this. And it happens in all our sports. It happens in Gaelic games, it happens in rugby, it happens in athletics. And, you know, the idea that, you know, that's just not how it happens. And on some days, I'm going to be the biggest dog in the playground. I was yesterday when I was sparring at the martial arts gym that I go to. And last week I got battered. You know, and it's just, that's just the way it goes. So all these narratives that we have around ourselves and what it means to be a man, but just one of the things that you covered there as well, and one of the things I've noticed myself, that there's a very active volunteer culture here. It's a similar thing to the GAA, right? Where parents and local people get involved in soccer clubs or in ice hockey or whatever it happens to be. It's often a positive influence, but not always. So if you have, and it happens a lot in ice hockey, that there's a lot of misogyny in ice hockey. I kind of liken it to maybe the rugby culture in Ireland as it maybe was in the past, right? And that's where you deal with these things. So I think there was a question there that we had about, you know, the environments that people are brought up in and what happens in those environments. It's extremely important not to put this on schools. And it's extremely important not to put this solely on parents, right? It takes a village to raise a child. And I'll give you an example of that. When I was coaching these lads from One Stop Along the Line here, these are the same fellas who 7 years ago would have been burning cars as teenagers, right? And I was coming to the end of a period of coaching them last year, and I realized that it was creeping back in again. This thing of calling a fella a faggot or a queer or whatever it was creeping back in again. And I said, there's 25 fellas in this WhatsApp group. I said, on average, if you take that, you know, somewhere between 5 and 10% of the population is gay, that means 1 or 2 of you are gay. Now imagine all the things that you're saying here and how you're making that person feel. And you don't know they're gay, and they're afraid to tell you, and you're perpetuating this. Think about this, lads. Think about what you're saying, because this is a guy who's going out on a Saturday at 3 o'clock and standing shoulder to shoulder with you, right? So we're either all in this together, or we may as well all go home. And at that point, I left the WhatsApp group, but one of the players I'm very close to, he told me there was absolute chaos after that, because they had this huge internal discussion about, and that's exactly what I was trying to provoke. I was trying to provoke this discussion about it, and there was some really uncomfortable things said. Going, look at that. Some lads were saying, oh, you know, this is not okay. Other lads were being homophobic and that kind of thing. But that's the discussion that I, as the adult in the group, had to facilitate. And I had to sort of sacrifice my position in there in order for this to happen. And I have to keep having those discussions. I have to keep having them with the 8 to 16-year-olds that I'm coaching in martial arts. I have to keep opening up for the fact that it's okay to have all these things. So it's a huge, huge thing. And this is, and again, thanks for asking me to come on and talk about this, because this to me is only the starting point. And anybody who's on this call or anybody who's listening to it or taking part in it, I'm open to absolutely anything that needs to be done here, because I see the need for it. I'm currently reading the biography of Mike Tyson and seeing how the only people who he looked up to were pimps and hustlers, and we all know how it went. He ended up in jail for rape himself, you know. So if we can save any young fella in Ireland or Sweden from that, I'm game.
Great. Thanks, Phil. And just so conscious of the time, guys, we have about 2 minutes. It runs by very, very quickly, the event. So, and I think rightly what you're saying, Philip, this is the start of a conversation. And it was only kind of like a primer really at the end of the day to have these kind of conversations. And I suppose in the final minute, I think one of the things I'd like to ask you, maybe, like you've mentioned, Philip, there, that what do we do around and you've given an example there about what you have been doing to create that shift, create that cultural shift. And I know we can do individually things as well as society-wise, in terms of how do we actually create the shift where it allows young boys to be their most authentic selves. And if you had one thing that you would do, I'm going to ask the four of you before we finish up about one thing that you would like to do, and you've about 1.5 minutes. Okay, so as quick as we can, it'd be great. So anyone who wants to jump in.
Shall I jump in there just to start off? But the one thing I would say is start early. Okay, so if you start early at kindergarten and you don't allow fellas to cut in the line in front of girls, you don't give them more attention just because they're louder, you know. So the earlier you start and the earlier you begin to say to children, look, we're all equal here. We all get the same amount. We all get the same chance of that. And that makes it much easier. For me, dealing with fellas who are 18, 19, 20 years old, I have to untangle the web that has been weaved on them from a very early age. But if I start at an early age, like a young fella told me the other day, he started crying on the mats when we were wrestling, and I went over to him and said, what's the problem? And it turned out that his grandfather had died the same day, and I was able to tell him it's okay to be sad about that. And he'd been holding it in for the first 40 minutes of the class, and then it just fell apart for him. So I took him aside, and to tell him that, I hope that stays with him. I can't say it's going to, but for me as an adult that he looks up to say to him, it's okay to cry when you feel sad. Hopefully that will be the starting point for him going forward as an 8-year-old.
Brilliant, Phil. Thank you.
Right.
That's it.
I just going back to, I know the school system, that's a long-term game, but I think it would be great to be able to change that. But also immediately, and linked to what Sarah was talking about, we really need to have kind of much better relationship education in school. I think Finian, again, it might have been something that I saw related to yourself, or it was the Irish Youth Foundation, or I just thought it was absolutely horrendous. It was scary that 1 in 5 young people would see pornography as being useful in understanding about sex and relationships. Like that is actually a blight on Irish society. I mean, that's unbelievable. And so that would be one thing that I really think would be important. And I really also think that we need to see caring as a good thing. We need to not see it as something that low paid or unpaid, mostly women do. It actually needs to be recognized as one of the most important things we can do. Sorry,
Sarah?
I agree 100% with both Philip and Edel's done before, so I'm just going to take them as my own and say that plus. I think so what Finian was saying really resonated with me, and I think that if we have set boys and men and possibly girls as well, I don't know, but if we're saying as a social aspiration, we are structuring things around success and failure, winning and losing. This is peaks and troughs. That is not the pathway to emotional well-being, because we're never always going to win, which means we're going to have to deal with failure, whereas actually an emotionally content way of being should not necessarily be always peaks and troughs. So there's something around how we deal with our language in terms of, and to me it's just a lot about language. I think we need to choose our words carefully when we talk about what success in life means, because it doesn't actually mean winning. And there's a lot of material on the folly of pursuing happiness as a concept, because happiness is like, we aren't always happy. The idea of contentment, the idea of that being through interconnection, and I think it's an awful around that. To me, it all comes back to that thing of you're not alone. That means you shouldn't feel like you have to go it alone. And sometimes when you feel alone, to be able to say, to reach out and know that you have connection there. So foster connection without it being about the highs and the lows of winning.
Brilliant, Sarah. And Finian, I'm going to give you the last word. If you
well, Sean, thanks again. I think for me, if you can in your everyday, call out the bad behaviour. I think as Edel alluded to, you're with the majority of people in terms of your attitude. Attitudes have dramatically changed in a generation. So call out the poor behaviour, and the majority of your WhatsApp group is going to support you on it and talk about the nuance of how we got to that point in our thinking. And also call out the good behaviour and highlight the good behaviour. So, the men who are doing something different, and the men who are being, caregivers, or even just valuing care, bringing in systems that bring about a more caring society, I think that's going to be key for us. And also, there's going to be a much better return to this. Everything is more directed towards a more kind of emotional and intelligent group of people that's needed, and cares at the heart of that. So calling out the good, highlighting it, and not staying silent on the poor practices that none of us really want to be involved in, and focusing on the good ones that we do.
Well, I think it's been a very quick 45 minutes, folks, if not nearly 50 minutes. And I think it's the start of this conversation. I'd like to go out again. There've been a couple of questions that we haven't been able to get to as well. And the general theme was very much though around sensitivity and opportunities for boys and men in which to portray their sensitivities or vulnerabilities and stuff like that. And there was another question in relation to kind of how men are treated in courts and stuff like that, but that's probably another discussion on another day. So again, and I think for me, what's come out of it today for me, I think one of those key words is around caring, and that, certainly that aspect of care that's come about through the COVID in terms of the roles that fathers and brothers and sisters and boys have taken up, and I think we began to value that notion of caring and brought it to a level of professionalism, as opposed to seeing it as the menial job that had to be done, has been really gratifying to see that actually happening. And I think that it's valued, and that men should be significant carers and should take that role on it. So again, I want to thank each and one of our panelists there, Sarah, Edel, Philip, and Finian, for your contributions. It was really fantastic and much appreciated. And to all those who attended and had our questions, again, thank you. And we will be back again. I think the one great thing about COVID has let us begin to believe that we can actually communicate with each other in new ways that allows us to get into many, many rooms of many, many people. So on behalf of the Men's Development Network, I would say thank you, and we'll see you all again. Cheerio.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting us.
Not at all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye now.